Good afternoon and welcome to the second in a series of webinars on identity by Candatis. This webinar will last for around 30 to 40 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. My name is David Manning, I'm an architect, and I'll be joined once again by Dave Downs, one of our senior developers here at Candatis. For anyone who missed it, we have a recording of the Introduction to B2C webinar on our website, in which Dave gave an overview of the principles of identity and the ways in which B2C can assist in achieving them, with a focus on the use of B2C custom policies at the heart of a centralized identity and access management system. Today, we're going to delve a little deeper into the policies themselves, what they look like, how they're created and deployed, and how they're then used by relying party applications to perform the desired tasks associated with access management. Dave will lead us through a series of scenarios and some associated code snippets to illustrate the process. So we'll start with a simple scenario of a service provider wanting to implement an identity and access management system for a service. Assume that they're happy to use OpenID Connect as the protocol, and they need to allow users to register with an email address, supply their first and last name, and then select a referrer of some sort from a list of companies. So we start with the basic wireframe, showing what I think the sign-up process would look like with the company logo and the styling applied to the resultant pages. In this case, I guess we would use a combined sign-in and sign-up policy to handle new and returning users. And good practice would be to include a verification process for the email address to ensure that it's correctly captured and that the registrant has access to it, as that will then be used as the login identifier for subsequent logins. So what do these requirements mean for the development of custom policies, Dave?
Okay, let me switch over to maybe a bit more of a practical demonstration. So if I click there. So what we have here is, on the left-hand side of the screen, a basic relying party. So this is the website that the customer's got that they want to integrate with B2C. In our case, we've just set up a standard OpenID Connect website. All it's going to do is allow you to sign in and display some claims, but you know, in a live system, this could be a customer portal, it could be, you know, whatever service the customer's offering that they want to secure. On the right-hand side, we've got some of the custom policies that make up these user journeys. Now, as we talked about on the previous webinar, the custom policies are ultimately just XML files and they're hierarchical. So what we can see here is that we've actually got 4 files that are making up this journey. We've got the sign-in policy, which is the policy that we're actually going to execute, the one that says to B2C, here's the steps you need to go through to sign the user in, to sign the user up, and to communicate with the relying party. We've then got another policy called sign-in base, and this one defines the components that make up that journey. So where sign-in's got the actual logic that the B2C goes through, sign-in base contains all the components that that logic uses. We've then got extensions, which can define some components that are specific to this project, but that apply across multiple journeys. So where sign-in base defines components specific to sign-in, extensions might define components that apply across a wide range of different journeys. And then we've got a base policy, which we might use across multiple different projects or things that aren't necessarily entirely related to one specific project. So all of these, each of these policies inherits from the previous one. So sign-in inherits from sign-in base, inherits from extensions, inherits from base, which means that we can kind of segregate, we can target specific logic into particular files to make it easier to manage and make it so that we're only focusing on what we care about for that particular, you know, part of the system that we're looking at, but still have a full journey available through one user journey policy. So let's take a look at this policy, the user journey policy, and what exactly it is that it's going to tell B2C to do. So we've got an OpenID Connect relying party. So we need to define in this user journey policy that we're going to have an OpenID Connect relying party connecting into B2C. We're defining that when it receives that connection and when it's executing the sign-in policy, then we're going to execute the sign-in user journey, which will be a user journey, a set of steps that we'll come to in a minute. We define a set of behaviors related to that relying party in that user journey, things like how single sign-on works, any telemetry that we want to capture, whether we want to execute JavaScript, that kind of thing. We then define how the relying party is connecting in, so in our case, OpenID Connect, and what we're going to return to the relying party at the end of the journey. So in our case, we're saying we're going to return the object ID for the user, which is just a unique ID that B2C knows about. We're going to return the email that they used to sign in with, their given names, their first name, surname, a display name, which is just their given name and surname combined together, and then this referrer property. And you'll see here that referrer is actually called extension referrer because it's not a native B2C property. It's an extension property that we've added to the schema beyond what B2C normally provides. So when I click sign in on my relying party, that's going to go over to B2C, and for this particular policy, it's going to execute the sign-in user journey, which we've defined up here as a set of 4 steps. So sign-in user journey, step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. Step 1 is just that we're going to display a combined sign-in and sign-up page. So if I click to sign in, so we get a page here that combines both sign in and sign up. It allows the user to sign in if they have an account. If they don't, it provides them with a sign up link. If they click that sign up link, then we're going to progress past this step on to step 2. If they sign in with their user details, we're going to progress past step 1 on to step 2. Step 2 does the actual sign up page. Now we only want that to be shown if the user hasn't signed in. So we have a check on there, a precondition to say, if we've read the object ID because the user signed in, because we know who they are, then skip this step. Don't do a registration. We know who the user is. We don't need to capture any more details. We can just skip straight past this step. Whether we do a sign in or a registration, we want to read some additional information from the user. So we might capture everything during registration, but during sign-in, we'll only return a small set of information, which is usually just some of the fields native to B2C. We're using at least one extension property here, so we just want to read everything back from the directory to make sure, specifically when we're doing a sign-in, we've got all of the user's information when we go into step 4, which is to send the claim, send the token back to the relying party. And here, because we're using an OpenID Connect relying party, we're using a JWT issuer. We want to issue a JWT token, which is the token that's consumed by OpenID Connect clients. So if we skip over sign in for the moment, if we go straight into sign up, so we're going to skip past this step by going sign up now, which takes us onto the registration page, much as we saw in the wireframe. So you'll see in my user journey, all I'm doing is saying execute this one particular step, execute a user registration step. How does it know what fields to display and in what order? That all happens because I've linked my registration step to a particular technical profile, in this case called user account signup. So that's one of the common components that we're inheriting from sign-in base. So if I go look at that, so I've got my user account signup technical profile, which in our case is a self-assert technical profile, which basically just means that we're expecting to capture some data from the user from one of the B2C pages. We're specifying that it's got a particular content definition reference ID, which all that is just the page template, and we'll come to that later. But we're also specifying what we expect to capture from the user and in what order. So you can see here in my output claims that the things that I expect to output from this self-assert, the things I expect the user to provide. I'm capturing a sign-in email. I'm capturing a password, and I want the user to re-enter it. So email address, password, they re-enter it. I'm capturing a given name, I'm capturing a surname, I'm capturing the referrer. So all of my fields are defined as output claims. When this page executes, when I continue, when I submit, we want to run some validation on what I'm going to capture, and that all happens in the validation technical profile, which again, we'll fill some bits out and then we'll come to what that's doing. One of the requirements was to verify the email, to send a one-time passcode to make sure that it's all A-OK, you know, the user owns that email address, that they can prove that, you know, that they can receive something. So what we've done here is just using the default B2C built-in logic, we've said that the sign-in email that we capture needs to be a verified email. So when we use that, B2C knows that it can use its default built-in logic to send a verification code, send an email to the user just using the Azure Active Directory. That'll give the user a one-time passcode. They can enter that and, you know, prove that they own that email address. So if I do some of this, what does that look like? So if I go, I enter my email address and I send my verification code. You can see at the moment, because I've not verified, I can't continue. The continue button's grayed out. So if I go to my inbox and I grab that verification code, which can sometimes take a second. Here we are. So all that's done is just send me a unique 6-digit verification code. It'll be unique each time. You can see here, you can send a new code if it doesn't come through, can try and verify it. If I enter the wrong code, then there's validation to make sure, you know, I can only do that a set number of times, I get errors and so on. So let's just verify that. So my email address has now been verified. I've proved through the receipt of that code that I own that email address and I'm allowed to register. So we'll put a password, you know, pretty standard stuff. If I enter a different password, then as you'd expect, it does some validation to make sure that my password entry fields match. It also does some basic validation on the fields to say first name and last name are required. And you can see over in my custom policy that I've said that given names required and surnames required, so it's just running a bit of validation. I haven't said refer is required, so it's not running that. I don't have to supply it. So my first name, yeah, last name, and then where did I hear about us? We've just got a basic drop down with some referrers. So I heard about this from the podcast. Now when I click continue, that's going to post back to B2C, and that's going to run this validation technical profile. So it's going to validate that all the information that I've entered is correct, in addition to the validation that it ran on the page, client side, just for, you know, ease of customer use. So to do the validation, it needs to know what the rules are. So here, what we've done is we've set up a technical profile that tries to create the user in the directory using their email address, using the email address that they've entered. So all that is just another technical profile that writes to the Azure Active Directory behind B2C. If the user's email address already exists, then we raise an error. If it does already exist, we've got a particular error message that we can display. So you're already registered, press the back button and try again, you know, pretty standard stuff. We are looking for that user by their email address. So to determine whether it should raise this error, whether the user already exists, then we want to search based on the email address that the user entered, and that maps to a particular property on the Active Directory. And then assuming that they don't, we want to save them to the directory. We want to create a new user. So again, we want to write their email address to that same property. We want to set their password to whatever they entered. We want to disable the Azure AD password policies because we're going to be using the B2C ones. And we want to set, you know, all the details that we've just captured, their given name, their surname, their display name, and their referrer. Now, you might notice that I've skipped over a couple of properties on the page, and that's object ID and display name. I've defined those as output claims, as things that I want to come out of my self-assertion attribute provider, but they're not being displayed on the page for the user to enter. And that's because they're coming from the validation technical profiles. Down here, once I've done my persistence, once I've written the user to Active Directory, then I'm saying out of the result of that, out of the user that gets returned from that action, I want to output their object ID, so the unique ID from Active Directory. I want to output their user principal names, just some more unique information. And I want to output their display name just to make sure that, it's been written correctly to Azure AD. Because we're outputting those things from this validation technical profile, B2C is clever enough to join that up with the self-assert technical profile and say, okay, I can see that they're coming out of validation, therefore I don't need to capture them from the user. So I could add any other output claims in here that I don't want to capture from the user, but that are coming out of my validation technical profile. You can have more than one validation technical profile. So if I want to run multiple steps, if I want to say write to a CRM, or I want to do some audit logging or something like that, I can just add additional validation technical profiles after this one, and B2C will execute them all, assuming there are no errors to any of them. Any errors will be returned back to the user. So that's fairly in-depth for what registration's doing, but we've executed step one. We displayed the sign-in page. We didn't sign in, we did a registration, so we went straight on to step two. When I click continue, that's going to finish executing my registration, go on to step three. It's going to read the user back from the directory, but we're not going to see anything. And then step four is just to issue my claims. So if I continue here, if I change my password, that is correct. And all that's happened there is it's returned us back to our relying party, so back to our OpenID Connect relying party, with all of the claims that we defined as the result of our user journey. So it's returned us with an object ID, which here gets passed as name identifier by our relying party. B2C supplied some information about the policy that we executed. So we executed the B2C 1A sign-in policy, which is our user journey policy up there. We've got the time that we authenticated. We've got the email address that we requested, the given name we requested, surname, referrer, which we've just stuck in a referrer claim, and our display name that we stuck in a display name claim.
Okay, so that's registration. Presumably, if you then did sign in, because it's a combined policy.
Yep, so if I sign out for a second, so now what we're expecting, if I do a sign in, so I think it was demo one. Enter my password. So what we're expecting here is step one, it's going to do the sign in. Because we read back the user profile's object ID from AAD, it should skip over step two. We shouldn't see a registration page. Step three, it just reads everything from Active Directory. So we're reading that extension property. Step four, we're issuing the claims. And I probably have got my email address wrong there. I have. Sign in. So there we go. So, I mean, in a way that demonstrates that it is doing a check on the Active Directory. It's looking for, the user that you've registered. So in my case, email address is wrong. I get an error. Email address is right. It signs me in. Again, exactly the same object ID claim, same class reference, authentication time, and then my custom claims, including the referrer read from Active Directory.
Excellent. So we've now got policy for sign up and sign in, but it wasn't branded. It used some default Microsoft branding. So what do we need to do now to personalize that?
Yep. So if I sign out, let's just go back to that default branding. So yes, you're right. This is the default Microsoft branding, one of the templates that comes with the tenant. So let's start here. So we talked about when we're doing the sign up, we specify a content definition, a particular template to use to display that page, and that's what decides for the sign in, for the sign up, for any page you want to capture, what it should look like, how should it be styled. So we've specified in sign up that we're going to use the content.signup template. If I go back to our user journey, we've specified a particular template for the combined sign in and sign up this page as content.signin. We've defined all of those default ones in our base policy, our topmost policy, because we're always going to want some kind of styling on the page. So the default is just to use the built-in templates. So you can see here, I've defined some content definitions, a generic one that we could just apply to any page, one that we can apply to the sign-in page, and one that we can apply to the sign-up page. So each of these has a load URI, which is just a URL that's going to serve a HTML file that defines my template. It's going to define all of the styling that dictates what my page looks and feels like. B2C is going to use that URL to load my template, and then it's going to insert the particular page content into it. So all of this section here, all of these fields, the fields on my registration page, B2C builds those up from the technical profile that contains my output claims. That's how it decides, you know, what HTML inputs does it need to have, what buttons does it need to have, what links does it need to include. It then inserts that content into the template that's referenced here. So everything that's not that one small section is defined by this tenant default self-asserted page. And being a tenant default page, it's something that's just provided by the B2C tenant as one of the default templates. You can see here, there's a couple of different options depending on what you want to do. So self-assert is just your generic, I've got a page that's capturing some information. Unified is, I've got a page that combines a sign-in set of boxes with a sign-up link. I can either update those here, so I can change these URLs, or because the policies are hierarchical, I can choose to override them in one of my later policies. So if I go to my project-specific extensions policy, you can see here that I've already commented out, which I'll uncomment, a set of content definitions, which basically redefine those pages. So I'm setting up a generic content, a sign-in content, and a sign-up content here, and I'm giving them a different set of URLs. And those URLs just point to a website that I've set up that just returns a HTML page. We've set it up as an ASP.NET Core website that uses Razor to build a page and then just return that, but it is just a HTML page that B2C cares about. It could be hosted in, you know, any static CDN that you want. It could be hosted in Azure storage, anything like that. All B2C cares about is that it gets back a HTML page that it can insert its content into. So having commented that out, if I save that policy, if I go into my B2C tenant, so this is my tenant. This is where I've created my B2C instance. There's a lot going on here, but we don't really care about most of it at the moment. What we're particularly interested in is the changes that I've just made to my custom policy. Custom policies all live in the identity experience framework. So if we go into there, you'll see there's this section for custom policies. And down the bottom, I've already got the custom policies that I've uploaded to those four that I was dealing with a minute ago. So if I grab my link to this, if I copy that path, and then I upload a custom policy, and I put my link, and I want to overwrite the one that's already in there. So if I refresh this page, it now applies my custom branding with, you know, no more hassle than that. I've set up my site that serves the custom branding. I've updated my policy to refer to that site, and then B2C just takes that and says, okay, well, I'm just going to load your template from your site. I'm going to insert my content into it, and now we've got our branded sign-in page. If I click into sign up, you know, exactly the same branding. I had a different sign up template. So as you saw in here, we had content generic, so just any normal page, content sign in, because the unified sign in signups are a specific type of template. And I've got one specific for content sign up that serves a separate page. Now I could just use my generic one, but I want to do a bit of custom styling on here. I want to add in the bars between different sections. I want to make sure that my buttons are highlighting correctly and this is disabled and styled correctly. So I've set up a particular content definition with a particular page, a particular set of styling rules, so that I can style this particular page in a custom way. So I could do that for as many pages as I wanted, just set up different content definitions, different templates, different CSS, JavaScript, and do whatever I want. So if I go back to my sign-in over here and just demo. If I stop that trying to run.net, sign in. So then we're just back in our relying party. So I can set up the branding in B2C to essentially be the same as the branding on my relying party, so that I can provide a pretty seamless sign-in process for my users. I start out on my branded, Condatis relying party. I go to what looks like the exact same branded page, even though it lives in B2C. Sign in, and then I'm taken straight back to my same branded relying party. So users are getting a very integrated look and feel to their journey. It doesn't have to feel like this disjointed process where they're sent off somewhere foreign, somewhere they don't trust, to sign in. They feel like they trust the same system.
Perfect. So we've now got our combined sign up and sign in policy, and it's personalized. So it's using the branding that they wanted. You kind of alluded to it when you did the upload of the policy, but should we go into detail of the actual deployment process and the ability to link it to relying parties?
Yep. So yeah, so there's more sections to B2C than just the identity experience framework. It's built on top of an AAD, so there's a lot of features of AAD built in. But what we're really interested in here is, how does B2C fit together with the custom policy? So we've got this custom policy section. That's the actual user journeys, the actual logic that the user is going to run through. We've got some policy keys, which are basically just some keys that B2C hosts that'll help you generate, so that when you're generating a token, it gets signed in a way that your relying party can verify and be sure that it's not been tampered with. And then we've got app registrations, which are what link your application, your relying party, up to B2C, so that B2C recognizes them and will allow them to use the policies to authenticate. So you see, I've got a bunch of app registrations, but the one we're really interested in is the OpenID Connect relying party. This is my relying party here. So all I've done is register a application in the Active Directory. I've set up some information about the authentication to say, when a user tries to sign in using this application, then when they get to the end of their B2C journey, return the token to this. If I refresh that page without pasting things in. So when I reach the end of my journey, of my B2C journey, it's going to send the token back to a known page. So this Condatis B2C webinar OpenID Connect site, which is my OpenID Connect site over here, and it's going to send it to the sign in OIDC URL. So that's just a page in my site that can process the result of a B2C login, the result of an OpenID Connect login, and then pass up a token, do whatever it needs to do, generate a user session locally within my app, and that's all just using, freely available Microsoft libraries in this case, but whatever OpenID Connect library you prefer, really, that's just a standard way of setting up a return URL. Similarly, we've got a logout URL, so when the user signs out, when they sign out of a different relying party, we're telling B2C a URL on my relying party that it can go to make sure that the user session has ended locally, so we don't just leave local user sessions lying around when the user signed out of B2C. There's different OpenID Connect flows that you can make use of. We're not really going to go into those too heavily. Two of the more common ones are the implicit flow, where the token comes back via the browser, and the code flow, where it doesn't, a code comes back by the browser, and then our relying party server takes that code and exchanges it on the identity provider on B2C for a token, so the token never goes near the browser. We've set up in here a secret to allow the code flow to happen. So our browser receives a code from B2C, it doesn't receive the token. It sends that back to our server then exchanges that code with a secret to authenticate itself further to get back the token from B2C. So the token never comes near the browser, it never comes near the user. That all happens in the back end to keep that secure, prevent anyone from trying to hijack it or anything like that. And we've got some permissions, just some basic permissions that get set up for OpenID Connect, which we aren't really, needed for what we're talking about here. We don't really need to go into those. So really, we've got the policies which define the journeys. We've got the app registration, which defines an application in B2C that my app can link to. And then we've got the configuration of my app itself. So this is just another section of my Azure with my app hosted in it. And I've configured it to use a particular app registration's client ID. So if I go over to my app registration in B2C, we'll see that my client ID is E645 and then a bunch more numbers and E645. So I'm linking my app up to an app registration in B2C via this ID within my Conductis B2C webinar B2C login using that same domain. And then I'm saying when I do a sign in, I just want to execute the B2C 1A sign in policy. So all of this configuration feeds into the library that I'm using in my Relying Party application. Those details are the same as my B2C and an app registered in B2C. And then I'm executing a particular policy when I want to do a sign in. So we've got that three-pronged approach of my Relying Party, my app registration in B2C that relates to that Relying Party, and then my policy that dictates what's my user journey, what's my flow, what goes into actually performing an authentication.
Okay, so that's linking an OIDC Relying Party application to the policies. What if my service was SAML based rather than OIDC?
Yep, so largely similar. There's a few extra steps and a few extra tweaks. So we had right back at the very start, we've got this B2C 1A sign-in policy. It defines our user journey. So steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, show the login, show the registration, read from the user directory, and then send a JWT back to an OpenID Connect Relying Party. For SAML, we want to do some of that journey, but we want to change some significant bits. So we still want to do the sign-in, we still want to do the registration, we still want to read from the directory, but we don't want to issue a JWT, we want to issue a SAML token. And it's not going back to an OpenID Connect Relying Party, it's going back to a SAML Relying Party. So if I open up a new policy called B2C1A Sign-in SAML, what we've done is we've set this policy up to inherit from the sign-in policy. So we're making use of that hierarchy. We're saying we want to pull in everything that we've done so far, all the Relying Party, all the user journey, and then we just want to change some parts of it. So if we scroll down to the Relying Party again, down here, we're still saying that we want our default user journey to be sign-in. We're still setting up user journey behaviors, which are pretty much the same, single sign-on scope, how we're going to do JavaScript execution. When we come through to the technical profile that defines the Relying Party, though, instead of OpenID Connect, we're saying that they're a SAML Relying Party. We're saying something about how we want to sign the communication between the two systems, which we're not really that interested in, other than it's doable. You can change the signing. And we're saying again what claims we want to come out, what attributes we want to include in the token that we generate at the end, plus some additional SAML specific information just for this Relying Party. So we're going to be executing the sign-in journey, which we defined in the original policy. But this time, we're still going to do all the same steps, except when we come to step 4, send claims, instead of issuing using a JWT, we're going to be issuing using a SAML assertion issuer. So we're overriding how we're generating the token at the end of the journey. And all we're doing is using a technical profile that we define up here called SAML assertion issuer, which just says it wants to issue a SAML2 token. It's saying who's issuing it, so our B2C tenant. Again, a bit about signing, and then some of the keys from B2C that we're going to use for signing, then a bit about single sign-on that we can gloss over. So we've got here the same journey as we had for the OpenID Connect sign in and sign up, but we've overridden just the bits that we don't want to do with the SAML specific flavors of them. So if I sign out of my OpenID Connect Relying Party, if I go over to my B2C tenant again and back up to my, let's go back to B2C, back up to my identity experience framework, into my custom policies, let's upload a custom policy, and I'll grab my path again. So upload that one. We'll overwrite. We don't have it uploaded, but there's no harm in saying overwrite just in case. So it uploads our sign-in SAML policy. So what I've done is I've set up a SAML relying party. Oh, let's sign out that. It's just from previous session. I've set up a SAML relying party, so I can sign in to view my SAML2 claims. So same branding as my other relying party. I'm going to sign in. That takes us over to B2C, to our branded experience. So you can see here that I've got my B2C login URL, got my B2C domain. We're executing the B2C 1A sign-in SAML policy this time, and we've got a SAMLP SSO login URL, so it's using a SAML URL rather than an OpenID Connect URL. But again, I can do exactly the same as I had on my OpenID Connect login. I just sign in with that, and that takes me through to my SAML2 relying party with, you know, more or less the same claims that I had on my OpenID Connect relying party, plus a few extra that are SAML specific. So a session index, a logout name identifier, not really relevant to this relying party kind of from a user point of view, but things that a relying party might want to know to communicate back with the SAML identity provider. Now, one of the things that we talked about, one of the things that we touched on briefly to start with, but then didn't really go back to, was these user journey behaviors and the fact that we can define single sign-on. So we've set our OpenID Connect policy as having a single sign-on at the tenant level, and we've set our SAML policy as having single sign-on also at the tenant level. So that means that once you've signed into your B2C tenant using a policy, you then have a user session ongoing at B2C. You can sign in with another policy that also uses tenant, and that will just allow you to sign in. So I've signed in with my SAML one already. If I go back to my OpenID Connect relying party and do sign in, it's still going to execute my journey, so my step 1, 2, 3, and 4. But because I'm already signed in, it's not going to try to sign me in again. It's going to skip over step 1. Because I'm signed in and I have an object ID, it's not going to execute step 2. It'll execute step 3 to read me from the directory just to get the latest information, and then it'll execute step 4 to issue me with the JWT. So if I sign in, so you saw briefly it went off to B2C. It didn't display anything to the user, it just came straight back with all of the same claims for the user I've logged into with my SAML identity provider. And the same would be true with the registration. Because it's just using this policy to execute a journey, it doesn't care what you're doing, it cares about the fact that you've got this sign-on session going once it's complete, and then any other journeys with a matching single sign-on session can then make use of that, make use of the fact that you're signed in. Similarly, because we set up that logout URL, if I sign out of my SAML relying party, if I go back to home, I've now been signed out of my OpenID Connect relying party, because like there's a single sign-on session, if you sign out, B2C will do a single sign out. It will sign you out of everywhere that you've registered a sign out URL for that it knows that you're signed into. So you can ensure that if you sign out of one place, you're signed out of every place. Again, that's configurable. So if you don't want to do that, you don't have to have that behavior. So yeah, much the same as the OpenID Connect one, just with a few differences in how the journeys work.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. So I hope that that set of worked examples will give the attendees a good understanding of the process involved in creating and deploying policies to control access to different services. Shall we flip to the component parts?
Actually, just before we do that, one thing that comes to mind is the metadata for SAML. So we showed about the OpenID Connect setup, how we link this up to B2C, the fact that there's an app registration, that links to a configuration in OpenID Connect. We didn't really touch on that for SAML. It's similar, but it's slightly different, so it might be worth us just briefly touching on it. So we've still got an app registration for the SAML relying party, much as we did for the OpenID Connect one. But instead of us defining the URL that it goes back to, or the sign out URL in authentication, instead of defining secrets, what we do is we tell B2C via its manifest that there's a metadata URL. Our service provider, our relying party, exposes metadata, which is just done by a library in our case, that tells any identity providers where they should be sending tokens to, where they should be sending sign-out requests to. And similarly, B2C exposes its own metadata endpoint as the identity provider, telling the relying party where it should send sign-in requests to. They also exchange signing information and any encryption information, what the token looks like, that kind of thing. So where in OpenID Connect, it was more set up in the app registration kind of up front, with SAML, there's more configuration both of B2C and of the service provider itself to say, here's my metadata, here's a URL for each party to exchange that metadata, and then they can do it at runtime. If I go to my SAML configuration, you can see for my SAML relying party, which is again is just another .NET Core web app, I've just got my identity provider set up. I've got it set up with B2C, executing the B2C 1A sign-in SAML policy, and then I've got a metadata URL into B2C just to tell my relying party where it should be looking in B2C to get that metadata. So there's a bit more setup involved in SAML relying parties. You know, as part of doing this, I've had to set up some certificates and secrets for exchanging, which I didn't have to do with OpenID Connect. So there's a bit more overhead here up front than there is with OpenID Connect. So,
okay. So I think what we saw there was inheritance allows you to have common behavior. You can extend to support the two different protocols, making sure that your screens look the same, behave the same. There's a little bit more involved when it comes to the registration process and the setting up. So, but largely you can define your logic steps once and make use of them across the board.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is, you know, really a summary of what we saw there. We've got our relying party connecting via our devices, using one of a number of policies that we uploaded. So in our case, we were using the Identity Experience Framework to have B2C execute different steps. We had local accounts, so it's executing requests against its directory to make sure that when we're trying to sign in the user, that they've entered the correct username and password. That's all token based on the server. We did some email validation, so one-time passcodes to verify that the user owns that email address. We did user input for the usernames and passwords, and also for all the registration. And then we wrote the user to the user directory and finally issued a B2C token. So we used a number of steps from the larger diagram that we showed in the previous webinar, just focusing on specific parts for this, you know, more basic scenario.
Okay, thanks for that. And we'll expand on that in future ones as we cover more. We'll go back and fill in some more sections of that diagram. So, quick look at a couple of questions have come in. Can we use different branding for different apps or different areas of the same site?
Yes, yeah. So the way B2C does branding through those content definitions is very flexible. You can pass parameters to the request, to the HTML requests, and then based on those, do any logic that you need to do, or you can set up different content definitions for different relying parties and set up a policy that overrides them all. So you could have, like we had with the SAML and the OpenID Connect, you could set up a policy hierarchy that overrides your content definitions for different relying parties. Or if you're using something like ASP.NET or something similar, you could pass up a flag to the server that's serving the HTML and then do logic up there to decide, you know, I want to serve template 1, template 2, template 3, or whatever. So you get different branding based on what exactly is happening in your user journey, who's executing it, which relying party, that kind of thing.
Okay, pretty flexible then.
Yeah.
Okay, another question here. Could we automate the deployment using DevOps, for example?
Yes, there's some parts that aren't yet automatable. So things like the creation of the actual B2C tenant can't be automated yet. But things like the deployment of the policies, that's fully automatable. We do that ourselves through Azure DevOps. So we'll typically write a set of policy templates, and then we'll replace variables in those templates as we deploy to different environments, just through a standard Azure DevOps pipeline.
Excellent. Okay. Those are the only questions that we had. So thank you all for attending. I hope that you found the session useful and that you'll join us for the other webinars in this series. In the next session, we'll be covering federation and different levels of authentication. However, if there are any B2C related topics that you'd specifically like us to cover in later sessions, then please do get in touch. And just a reminder that we are also running a separate series of webinars on decentralized and self-sovereign identity. The first in that series was broadcast on the 21st of October, and that's available on our website if you didn't manage to catch it at the time. And the second in that series is scheduled for Wednesday, the 18th of November. So please make sure that you sign up for that if you want to understand the protocols used in decentralized systems using verifiable credentials. If you want to discuss any aspect of identity and access management, or if you're interested in using Azure AD B2C for your identity and access management system, please do get in touch with us using the details shown. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.